The Prague Spring of 1968 was a significant Cold War crisis that unfolded in Czechoslovakia, where opposition to Soviet control had been simmering for years. Czechoslovakia, like other Eastern Bloc countries, was tightly controlled by the Soviet Union, which imposed its model of centralized authoritarian communism on the country. However, by the late 1960s, there was growing discontent among the Czech and Slovak populations, who were frustrated with economic stagnation, political repression, and the lack of cultural freedoms. This discontent set the stage for a period of reform known as the Prague Spring. In January 1968, Alexander Dubček, a Slovak reformer, was appointed as the first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. Dubček sought to implement a new vision of socialism, one that was more humane and responsive to the needs of the people. He aimed to move away from the rigid policies imposed by the Soviet Union and introduce a series of reforms that became known as socialism with a human face. These reforms included greater freedom of speech and the press, the reduction of censorship, increased political participation, and a degree of economic liberalization. Dubček's policies quickly gained widespread support within Czechoslovakia, leading to an outpouring of cultural and intellectual activity, as well as a renewed sense of optimism among the populace. However, Dubček's reforms also alarmed the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries. The leadership in Moscow under Leonid Brezhnev was deeply concerned that the liberalization in Czechoslovakia could inspire similar movements in other Eastern Bloc nations, potentially threatening Soviet control over the region. The Soviet Union had already witnessed the unrest in Hungary in 1956, which had been brutally suppressed, and it was determined not to allow another Eastern European country to stray from the socialist path. The prospect of a more democratic and open Czechoslovakia was seen as a direct challenge to Soviet authority and the unity of the Eastern Bloc. Throughout the spring and summer of 1968, the Soviet Union, along with its Warsaw Pact allies, exerted increasing pressure on Dubček to roll back his reforms. Despite multiple warnings and meetings between Soviet and Czechoslovak officials, Dubček continued to push forward with his agenda, insisting that Czechoslovakia could remain a loyal member of the socialist camp while pursuing its own path to socialism. The Soviet leadership, however, was not convinced and began preparing for military intervention. On the night of August 20-21, 1968, the Soviet Union, along with forces from Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Bulgaria, launched a massive invasion of Czechoslovakia. Over 200,000 Warsaw Pact troops and thousands of tanks rolled into the country, swiftly occupying key cities, including Prague. The invasion was met with shock and outrage by the Czechoslovak population, who engaged in widespread non-violent resistance. Citizens took to the streets to protest the occupation, and there were reports of spontaneous acts of defiance, such as removing street signs to confuse the invading forces. Despite this resistance, the invasion quickly crushed the Prague Spring. Dubček and other reformist leaders were arrested and taken to Moscow, where they were forced to abandon their reform agenda. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia was widely condemned by the international community. Countries across the world criticized the Soviet Union for its blatant violation of Czechoslovakia's sovereignty and its suppression of a peaceful reform movement. However, despite the vocal criticism, there was little concrete action taken to challenge the Soviet invasion. The United States, embroiled in the Vietnam War and wary of provoking a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union, limited its response to diplomatic protests. Western European nations, while sympathetic to the Czechoslovak cause, were also reluctant to intervene militarily in the Eastern Bloc. As a result, the Soviet Union faced no significant repercussions for its actions in Czechoslovakia. The suppression of the Prague Spring ultimately strengthened the Soviet Union's control over Eastern Europe. The invasion served as a clear demonstration of the lengths to which the Soviet leadership was willing to go to maintain its dominance over the Eastern Bloc. The message was unmistakable. Any attempt by a satellite state to pursue a path independent of Soviet influence would be met with overwhelming force. This stance was formalized in the Brezhnev Doctrine, announced later in 1968. The Brezhnev Doctrine declared that the Soviet Union had the right to intervene in any socialist country whenever it deemed socialism to be under threat. This doctrine effectively justified the use of military force to ensure that no Eastern Bloc country could deviate from the Soviet model, reinforcing the Soviet Union's grip on its satellite states. The Prague Spring and its aftermath highlighted the limits of reform within the Soviet-dominated Eastern Bloc. While Dubček's experiment in Czechoslovakia briefly inspired hope for a more open and humane form of socialism, the Soviet invasion made it clear that such aspirations would not be tolerated. The events of 1968 deepened the division between East and West and reaffirmed the Soviet Union's determination to maintain its hegemony over Eastern Europe, solidifying the status quo that would persist until the revolutions of 1989.